My name is Martin Smith, and I'm a principal engineer at Rackspace, and I'm here to talk about reaping the rewards of remote-friendly DevOps. And I think that this presentation I sort of designed to be maybe an open-ended question. So I'm not sure if remote-friendly work and DevOps have a lot in common. I think they do, based on what I've heard in my own experiences, but I'm actually really interested in questions or thoughts, whether it's here during the presentation or on Twitter afterwards, or just whenever you have a chance in the hallway. Let me know if you think that it makes sense, because it seems to make sense to me, but I don't have all the answers yet for all of those sort of agile principles and how they might map to remote work. But I'm going to take a swing at it. So who am I? I started my career as a DBA and a developer and a sysadmin in higher ed. All those things you heard yesterday and this morning about how not to do DevOps, I worked in those organizations. We didn't even have the developers and operations together, but we didn't even have the network people in the same building. So everything that you've heard about how to do DevOps badly, I feel like I was even a generation before that. And so I did that for about 10 years locally in an office, and then I had this opportunity to go and work for Rackspace. And for me, this was like my first introduction into DevOps. Now, Rackspace as well, my title was DevOps engineer, another thing you're not supposed to do. But they were learning about DevOps at the same time that I was there. And so I felt like I was sort of on that same journey with them. They tried to do DevOps as a service. I don't know what you guys think about. Raise your hand if you think that's a good idea. As a service, you can just outsource DevOps. That's even worse than making a team locally for it, right, is to outsource DevOps. But I feel like I learned a lot about it. And I also started working remotely when I started working for Rackspace. So I'm from the United States. I'm from Florida. Rackspace doesn't have an office anywhere near there. So I kind of had an experience going into the DevOps community as well as the remote work community at the same time. And so now I work on their fanatical support for AWS product, which is a little different than the DevOps stuff I was doing before, but I get to work a lot in the Chef community, in open source, and I kept seeing a lot of themes with remote work. And when I worked locally in an office, I always was the guy wanting to have technical discussions, and when I started remote work, I feel like all I do now is talk about non-technical things, like Chris's presentation earlier about it's not a technical problem, right? So I feel like all of my biggest problems are non-technical now. And so I'm going to present some of those to you, but I have about 4 years of experience in remote work and playing around with this DevOps thing in organizations. So hopefully I can show you some places that are where they overlap, and you can tell me if I'm right. So DevOps and remote work, I was curious, I saw yesterday that we had mostly a local audience of Norwegians. Does anybody remote work now? So not a lot of remote workers here. My sense is that both Norway and Denmark and Sweden are not really on the forefront of remote work, that there's lower percentages of people doing remote work. But it seems like, do you guys think DevOps is taking off in Norway? Raise your hand if you think DevOps is taking off in Norway. Okay, there's a lot more hands. That makes me feel good, because I think maybe that also is going to lay the groundwork for remote work to take off. And tell me what you think about that. But I think that we need a definition of DevOps. I feel like a lot of people have already done that. I just took a bunch of terms from various projects. I'm not going to explain DevOps, but agile philosophy to operations is kind of how I think of it. Tools, reducing silos, continuous integration and delivery. And what's cool about DevOps is there's some hard data to back it up. Have you heard of the State of DevOps report? Anybody read that? Actually, wow, more than I thought. That's great. I think it's been going on for 3 or 4 years, but there's some really good stats in there that talk about what makes the most high-performing organizations successful, and correlations, not necessarily like if you do this, you will be good at DevOps, but some things that if you are good at DevOps, you probably do this. So I'm going to talk about some of those. So I also wanted to define remote work and the different types of remote work. In the US, the number is more like 40%. From my understanding and trying to do some research, there's not good numbers, but in Norway, it looks like it's less than 10%. Some numbers are less than 5% for remote work, but I wanted to talk about the different kinds, and I've done all of these. So I've been in an office where everyone else is in an office. I've worked where you have two teams, and they collaborate with each other, but no one's remote from everyone. The satellite model is that. You have a team in an office, and then a bunch of people working remotely, but they're the minority, and they're an exception. And then the remote first model, which is a fully distributed company. You see that, I think, GitHub is 75% distributed. You've got a couple other companies out there that are fully distributed. At Rackspace, I have been in all of these except the first one as well. So is anybody like in the multi-site world where you have maybe two teams separated by some geographic distance? That seems more common here from who I've talked to. Okay, so definitely a few people. I guess we don't have that many remote workers, so I won't ask about the other ones. But I think there's some things to keep in mind about remote work, is that it might be slower than co-locating, which seems to be a big theme in DevOps, is everyone is in the same room. But you can also get better staff remote work. You can get the best person on the planet. You can get, if you're doing Ruby on Rails, you can hire one of the people that helped write Ruby on Rails. Like, no matter how good you can hire locally in your country or your city or wherever you are, you're probably not going to find that level of quality of person. And so I think that that's important to keep in mind, that can make up for not being in the same location, as you can have someone who is a really big expert in their field. And that's something that Martin Fowler, who is a very prominent software engineer, has called out before. There's also exceptions. There are the productive people who can communicate really well without being in the same location, but they're probably the exception. And then there's also a lot of talk in the remote work community about things like communication, investing in tooling, face-to-face visits. These all sound like things that are in the DevOps community too. In fact, by the end of this presentation, I was looking at my lists thinking, is this the list I wrote about DevOps or the list I wrote about remote work? So there's some interesting stats about remote work. Forbes cited a report this year that said that remote workers were happier and more productive. There's a whole bunch of stats out there about remote work. But like at Rackspace, we don't even know how many people are remote working. So there's still a lot of data to be gathered. And I think that's probably one of the biggest deficits of remote work, is we don't really have good data anywhere. I've been pushing Rackspace to collect that data because we only know about the people that work remotely 100% of the time. We don't know about people that work 1 day a week at home, 2 days a week at home, occasionally when they need to receive a package or have a repair person come out to fix something. We don't know about those people, but they're definitely at least somewhat remote workers a lot of the time. So I also wanted to tell you, there's also this new sort of movement coming up called digital nomads. Has anyone heard of digital nomad? It's such a weird term. It's like DevOps. It's like it could mean anything. But I looked up Norway on this one site that tracks some of the best cities for digital nomads, and this was the order it came up in. And I've only been to Oslo. I don't know about these other cities, but these were from people rating cities to live and work in as nomads. This was the order that came up, so I thought that was interesting. I looked overall. Stockholm is number 20 on their list of the entire world, and Oslo was at number 97, but that was the only city in Norway. And it's, the list doesn't, you can't see how long the list is, but 97, I guess, first 100, top 100. So And why this is interesting to me is I've been working remotely at Rackspace for 3 years, but then in the last year, I joined a program called Remote Year, and it's where they take 75 people together and travel around the world to a different city and country every month, and everyone is a remote worker, and you give them some money in exchange for basically showing up in that city, and they say, here's where you're going to live, here's your office, we made sure you have good internet. And so I joined that program, the second group, the second cohort they've ever done, and I started at the end of January, so I've been in South America for 4 months, and I'm in my last month of 4 in Europe, and I'm going to be living in Malaysia next month and spending 4 months in Asia working remotely. So I feel like I started with sort of vanilla working remotely from home, where I could go, get up in the morning, walk into my office at home and work, and now I feel like I'm on remote work on steroids. People say, what kind of remote work do you do? And I say, it's extremely remote. So I feel like I sort of drank the fire hose of remote in the last year, in addition to all of my previous work at Rackspace being remote. Now I'm starting to struggle with new things that I never had before, like time zones or co-working spaces. I can tell you so much about co-working spaces that I didn't know about before embarking on this year-long journey. But I wanted to sort of think about things that I've learned while being remote that might apply to DevOps. And maybe DevOps can teach remote work some things. Maybe remote work can teach DevOps some things. Maybe you tell me what you think about that. But there's no question that we're going to be dealing with remote work, and hopefully you're dealing with DevOps everywhere. You've got countries in Asia, the numbers are a lot higher. They're 35 to 30% of people working remote. The average remote work from home is 10% across the world. Again, there's not good data, but it seems like it's growing. I did look. Germany, Sweden, France, Italy, and Canada have less than 10% remote work across their workforce. Norway wasn't even on that list, but that was sort of the lowest bracket that came in. So I think that's interesting. And the first thing I wanted to present to you was culture, and trust is the foundation. Now, you see this in lots of remote work advice and DevOps advice. This is sort of one of the biggest things you see actually talking about DevOps is trusting your people. Well, with remote workers and management not being used to having someone they can see and look at and touch and say, sit back in your chair, you have to trust your employees. So I thought that was an interesting first one for remote work and DevOps. They seem to have this in common, but I don't have any good data for it. There is data for some coming up. But you see pain points that people talk about for remote work is remote being an exception. To me, that sounds like sort of hero culture, right? The culture in DevOps of having heroes that solve the problem, stay up all night, that isn't sustainable and creates burnout. To me, the remote exception is sort of some version of hero culture. Maybe you agree, maybe you don't. I think that transparency is another one that we talk about in DevOps. You have to have be fully transparent across the organization, and thinking about things like when you send messages to other teams, when you even things like when you're working, right? So remote work, when you're actually at your desk, is sort of a question of transparency. People don't know. They write you at weird times. To me, this is like being in a sort of pre-DevOps organization and your manager sends you an email at 10 p.m. and you think, okay, they're working at 10 p.m. What message does that send to my culture? And then, struggling with that with time zones and remote work, you've got that same calculation to make is, if it's 10 p.m. my time, do I answer when someone in the United States says, hey, can you look at this bug? And I've already set Slack to everything I can think of, do not disturb, the little sleepy sign, and they write you anyway, right? So I feel like there's the same struggle that we have with creating a culture in an organization and figuring out, do I respond to email? And that sort of goes back into accountability. I think that Tools are a big one for stuff like accountability, and everybody in DevOps loves their tools, so maybe there's some overlap there. Even the same tools, I think, might be interesting to talk about. You read lists of the best apps for working remotely, and then some of them are the same lists that you see for the most popular tools in high-performing DevOps organizations. So that one's kind of a fuzzy one for me. But the next one I have is a more concrete piece of data about happy employees. So the State of DevOps report, the last few years, has talked about happy employees being strongly correlated with high-performing organizations. And that always, I love to tell that to people that are disappointed with their organization. I say, tell them you'll be more successful as an organization if your employees are happy. That's like a really happy message to tell people. But then I think that you also have stats that show that remote workers are sometimes, Harvard Business Review studied them and said that remote workers are 50% less likely to quit. You've got Stanford doing a study saying that 87% of remote workers have higher engagement. You've got a 2016 study by Forbes saying that 45% of remote workers love their job in a survey, whereas in the office, only 24% of workers said they love their job. So DevOps, happy employees, remote workers, happy employees. I'm not saying there's causation there, but maybe there's some things we can learn from each other about things like Rackspace uses a survey methodology called NPS, Net Promoter Score. If you've heard of that, that's a great way to study your employees and whether they would recommend their organization or their team is a good place to work. Maybe DevOps organizations should start asking that question too. I think that'd be really interesting to have more data around that. You even have some individual companies publishing that data, which is really cool to see at a place, for example, I don't know if GitHub does this, but GitHub, if they were to publish whether their employees recommend their team or GitHub is a good place to work, that would be really interesting to me to see those numbers. But I think that has some commonality between DevOps and remote work. Another one is about diversity. There's a lot of studies that show more diverse teams are more successful. And there's also remote work is a boon to diversity. So that one, I don't have some good data. Again, I would love some good data. Data I do have shows that, to use GitHub as an example again, they're 75% remote, and they have one of the best margins for, they have, 36% women, 64% men in their organization, and that's actually pretty good for the tech industry. And so they're also seen as someone that does things like chat ops, automation. They're seen as a high performer, I think, in the DevOps space. So this one, I would love some better data. There's other things like this, it's good for the environment, it's socially minded, it's just good for everything, remote work, but I'm not sure how I can really tie that directly to DevOps. If you have ideas, I'd love to hear them. Another one is this infrastructure as code, automation. We hear this one a lot, and I think that you have a lot of companies that are fully distributed. If you've heard of Basecamp, they used to be 37 Signals. They invented Ruby on Rails, which led to the rise of Twitter, GitHub, lots of other really cool industries, and they fully distributed, they do infrastructure as code, they have remote workers. I think that chat ops, I think a lot of these things lend themselves to remote work. And I don't know, I don't have good data on that, but I can tell you, being on this traveling journey for a year, that I see so much more automation from the people that work in IT when they have to choose between staying in a co-working space or going on a boat in the Mediterranean or hiking a volcano. They're gonna automate everything because they don't want to miss that. It's a series of once-in-a-lifetime opportunities, and I've seen so much automation, everything from when their emails go out to whole site deploys where I think in Uruguay I saw somebody deploying a site crossing a busy street on their way to the beach, hitting a button on their phone. So I think to be fully untethered from a desk means automation in our industry. And I think that if you were to go remote and your organization does DevOps really well, you probably wouldn't, you'd be fine. But if you didn't do DevOps well, if you didn't have that culture, if you didn't have automation, if you didn't have tooling, you'd know pretty quickly when you were in a different time zone that all that stuff is missing, because your job would get really hard really fast, I think. So I think that's an interesting one to think about. If you're not chained to your desk, automation is your friend. So those kind of feed each other, but again, not good data on that one. Another one that I had here was measurement. So a culture of data-driven decision-making is really popular in DevOps. And I think this is something DevOps has to teach the remote work world. So a recent study by FlexJobs and a government NGO in the United States called World at Work found that only 3% of organizations measure their return on investment for remote work. That just seems crazy to me, that you're going to make decisions and only 3% of the industry is even figuring out what the return on investment for remote work is. So I think that's something where in a DevOps culture, we can start to use this data-driven decision-making to make HR decisions like remote work, show me the data. I think that's something that DevOps communities and culture do really well, is bring data to the discussion. And some of them had even no formal policy at all, much less data. They don't even know what they're going to measure, which I think is really surprising for some of these companies are huge. Some of them are some of the biggest remote work companies that were studied in that study, and they don't know how effective they are. A lot of the data around remote work is self-reported survey data. So I feel more effective when I remote work, but that's not the business. That's not the customer outcomes. That's just an employee's opinion. So that was interesting. Another one is communication. You hear about communication all the time in companies undergoing a DevOps transformation. Communication is one that you hear all the time from people that work remotely too. I feel like at Rackspace, I'm the biggest cheerleader for over-communicating. I probably drive them crazy, but over-communicating as a remote worker is hugely important, because you have to overcome all those other gaps that might exist in your organization that get filled by the water cooler conversation, or walking from your car into the office with your boss and giving them an update. So communication and tooling really around communication is huge. One really fun thing is I do see a lot of these tools overlap in the DevOps and the remote work world. The group I'm traveling with actually uses Trello to plan really cool events that are going to happen in a city. So, they might say Bastille Day is in France, and we're going to be in Istanbul, and I'm going to put a due date on the Bastille Day card to remind everyone that we should take a side trip for the weekend to France and celebrate Bastille Day. Which is really funny, but I don't even know what else Trello is being used for, but that's probably only the tip of the iceberg. But these tools, some of them overlap. There's another one I want to plug. So this is the GitHub's Hubbot logo. Probably everyone's heard of Slack and HipChat, but another one is one I learned about recently called Sakoko, and that's their logo, that guy with the mic, and that's one where they create a virtual office, and you actually, in your web browser, it's Chrome-based, you walk into the map of the office, and if you unmute, you turn colors, like you can see that somebody is talking to one of your colleagues. There's little doors. It actually indicates whether your webcam is on. It feels like you can bump into people, right, remotely. So remote workers love their tools just as much as the DevOps community. I think continuous improvement on them might not be something that remote work has got figured out yet, but mostly just because there's no good system for it. Let's see, everyone loves Skype, emojis and GIFs. Those are all popular ways to communicate. There's nothing better than getting a pull request in GitHub and having it be an animated GIF of the bug being fixed, right? Like, there's also nothing better than some of the fun memes you see in Slack with the people that I'm traveling with for the year. There's some pretty funny ones in there too. Always assume ignorance before malice is a big one on communication. And I have some slides later on in here for some tips, but always assume ignorance before malice on that is good advice. Goal-focused and results-based work. FaceTime, again, really hard. Remote work you can't really see that someone's sitting in their seat for 8 hours. I think that same principle of results-based work is really popular for DevOps too. You stop looking at how long your employees were in the building and start looking at customer outcomes, right? That's really good for remote work. I think that probably there's not good data on it, but remote work and the DevOps culture are about on the same opinion about those things. Let's see. Some other struggles I just wanted to point out. I don't have a lot of time left, but the tech world is very different than being a writer or a graphic designer for remote work. So I think that maybe DevOps is better compared to people that remote work in the tech industry than anywhere else. People feel guilty about working remotely. Leaders change culture. Back to that email situation where you talk about when your CEO sends an email, that's a big deal. Leaders change culture for remote work, and leaders change culture for DevOps. There's some other things in here like being lonely, traveling to see your team. That's a big one in DevOps as well. But leaders really change culture. That's the biggest takeaway, I think. And when you're evaluating DevOps or remote work, you ask some of these same questions. They're all questions about culture and communication. And I think that the best thing to do when you're thinking about if you're looking for a job in a DevOps organization, ask these kinds of questions. They actually predict how successful remote work is going to be as well. Trust within the team is a huge one when you're remote, and it's a huge one if you're in an organization trying to adopt DevOps. I'll leave those up there, but you can read them yourself. They're really obvious ones, but it turns out they're good predictors for both. Let's see. Also, if you're looking at job ads, I would say look at who else is remote. This is the same question if you're looking at joining an organization. How agile are you, right? Who else is remote? Those are, to me, sort of parallels. You want to look at companies that have the same benefits for remotes and for local workers. Social media and blogging about remote work. Some of the best remote work companies actually talk a lot about it in their social media presence. And so I think the same is probably true for some of the best places that have a DevOps culture. If you've never looked at one of, say, GitHub's How We Work at GitHub presentations, they're really, really interesting. Similarly, there's some companies that do remote work that talk about how they follow the sun or how they structure their day that are also really interesting. And just watch out for the laundry list. This is true with DevOps and remote work. I don't like the concept of the 10x developer, and just look at their culture. I think that that's something remote work and DevOps have in common, is it's not a due date where you say by May 1st we're going to adopt DevOps, and by May 1st everyone's going to be remote. Like, neither of those are really possibilities. So I think they have a lot to inform each other about how to work best and how organizations function. Let's see. Then that's really, I'll leave you with a slide about the perceptions about working from home. I think the DevOps culture has some perceptions too. There's some really good DevOps ones like this, but there's not as many funny remote work ones. But yeah, that's it. I left some resources on a later slide, which I'll put up if you want to check it out, for jobs, community, the digital nomad community. But I wanted to see, do we have time for any questions, or are we running right up against it? Not really. So hit me up. Tell me if you think I'm wrong. Tell me if you think I'm wrong on Twitter. The internet loves someone who's wrong. Let me know. Or hit me up in the hallway if it's completely crazy, or if you have an idea for collecting some data about either of these. So that's it. Thank you very much.